Caveh Zahedi is an American filmmaker, actor, and professor at the New School in New York. Caveh holds a philosophy degree from Yale University and also attended film school at UCLA. If you've seen the movie Waking Life from Richard Linklater, which greatly inspired this podcast, by the way, you might recall the scene Holy Moment, where Caveh goes on an existential rant about a potential ontology of film.
But we walk around like it's not holy. We walk around like, there are some holy moments and there are all the other moments that are not holy, right? But this moment's holy, right? And I feel like film can let us see that, can frame it so that we see this moment, holy. And it's holy, 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 moment by moment.
His work is known to be autobiographical, provocative, and controversial. The glue tying his multiple creations together seems to be a commitment to radical honesty. A friend of mine recommended The Show About the Show to me, directed by Caveh, a TV series in which each episode is about the making of the previous one. Since then, I've been investigating Caveh's philosophical experiments, from his movie I Am a Sex Addict, which exposes his internal struggle dealing with sex addiction, to In the Bathtub of the World, where Caveh records and compiles glimpses from his day, every day for a year, and his most recent podcast. Recording myself and everyone around me destroyed all my relationships, so I'm doing a daily audio journal instead, where Caveh records personal accounts of his day, again every day for a year. Together we unpack Caveh's extraordinary worldview, from his commitment to honesty to his artistic motivations.
It just seems really clear to me that you don't have to look outside yourself to be political or to try to make the world a better place. You're always making it a better or worse place at every moment, no matter what you're doing. And that should be where the focus is, one's own actual sphere of influence versus some imaginary, hypothetical sphere. So I just started doing art and making art about my life, just something I had a little bit of control over and some perspective on.
I'm Carlota Guedes, and this is the Waking Youth Podcast. I like to start my interviews by grounding things in a little bit of personal history. And one of the things that I would like to know about you is spirituality seems to be something that is important to you, and something that has changed your view of spirituality throughout time. So I'm curious how you would begin talking about the spiritual background of your childhood.
Well, I think, just naturally religious as a child. I used to pray to God. I don't know if you've heard the 365 Stories podcast.
Partially.
But I tell a story there about, I want to call it a miracle that happened when I was about 6, where I had a prayer that was very specific and weird, and it happened, and I felt like there was some miracle making ability that I had that didn't ever happen again. But at a certain point, I stopped believing in God and was an atheist for many years.
Why?
And that, why?
Uh-huh.
And I just questioned it, and I don't know. I just stopped.
Mm-hmm. This was at what point, more or less, to situate myself?
Maybe from 10 to 23.
Mm-hmm.
And, gradually, and then sort of militantly atheistic in college, and then psychedelics, I had experiences where it was obvious that I had been wrong And, I had direct experience of God. So I started believing again, but just in a very, I don't know, vague way. Like I didn't, it was clear to me that God existed, but I didn't have a clear set of beliefs about it. And then I read A Course in Miracles. You know that book? Have you read it?
No, not yet.
But that really changed my life more than anything ever has. And I think I was a certain kind of person before that and a different person after that. Psychedelics also, like I was a different person before psychedelics and after. But then there was this further shift after the book.
Can you talk a bit about the difference, or it's too abstract to even
No,
try to describe?
it's very concrete. It's very concrete. I believed in revenge until then. Like I just believed in it. I thought people should be punished. And if they were punished for their misdeeds, that would encourage them to be better. And I don't know, like I believed in justice and it seemed important to me. And I thought I was doing the right thing by being retributive when people did things that I thought were bad. And I had a friend, my best friend, and we had a fight over something stupid. And I was just irrationally angry and obsessively and unreasonably angry, to the point that I was obsessing about just basically having like murder fantasies. And it was clearly taking too much of my mental space. And I was becoming like a broken record about how awful this person was, who was my best friend. And then I read the book and I understood that revenge is a mistake. I mean, maybe the biggest mistake. And that I was only hurting myself by being angry. And that I needed to forgive my friend. And that forgiveness was actually the way to happiness and to God. And I just suddenly had a whole different way of thinking about what's important and what's true. And, it was like a revelation. And ever since then, like, I'm still vengeful on some level, and I'm still blamey, like I still am judgmental, but I don't believe in it anymore. Like I don't align with it intellectually, which I used to. So now it's just like a problem I have that I have to work through or work on, as opposed to something I'm behind. Like I'm not behind it anymore. So that's made a huge difference, both in my happiness quotient and in my kindness quotient. And I just think, I don't know, I just think everything is better. And I still struggle with it. I'm still angry right now with a few people in my life who I feel are doing things that are hurtful to people I care about. But I don't believe that my anger is helpful or right. And I'm trying to like not align with it.
I'm curious to ask you this question. It's a theme that sometimes I sit with, because like you, I was a believer. Then there was a period that it was cool to not believe when I was in high school mostly. And then with transcendental experiences that I felt that direct access to something greater. And also I started being introduced to to some references of spiritual books or teachers that really influenced the way that I think and perceive the world. But sometimes, and you seem to have a very active intellectual life, and the intellectual pursuit seems to be something that is important to you. and particularly the philosophical pursuit of, the answers to the big questions of life. And then there's spirituality. And I feel that sometimes, at least I question my spirituality because there's a limit to how far my intellect can claim to know, right? So sometimes there's this question, do I believe or do I just stay in the not knowing? So I'm curious if for you really feel this faith and that you're held by that something greater, or if it's something more, I'm open to the not knowing, but I stay in the mystery and I'm more agnostic in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have doubt, and I don't have perfect faith, and I believe in not knowing is a good place to be. Like, I believe in not knowing, but with matters of faith, I do think that part of the spiritual path is a kind of, what Kierkegaard would call the leap of faith, that there's I mean, of course you can't know for sure anything. And yet there's a level in which we do know. And if we embrace that knowing, I mean, it's like, what is happiness really other than just faith in happiness or belief in happiness, or belief that it's okay to be happy, or belief that the happiness is real? At some level, it's all just faith. So I don't have a problem with faith intellectually at all. And I think intellect is a lower thing than faith, and that it usually gets us in trouble, or like we have to give up our ideas about things in the spiritual path, and the giving up of what we think or know or our comfort around, the grasping and the putting things in the boxes that we're comfortable with, I think is part of the problem. It's part of what keeps us from God or from happiness or from our true self, our deeper self. So I don't value intellect over spirituality at all. And I don't think that they're incompatible. But if there were a hierarchy, I would choose non-intellect.
Okay, cool. A central question of this podcast or theme is this process of becoming. And we focus particularly on the becoming an adult. And what I'm curious to explore is a little bit of the thought process or the faith process of your own journey of becoming. And I know that you had an interest in politics and activism. You have shared this in many other places, how at some point it became clear that you wanted to pursue, or that you had this decision between, I suppose, a lot of things, but mainly art and politics, or activism and art, and you pursued art. So I'm just curious to explore this thought process of yours, and in the end, why you pursued one and not the other.
I mean, there's that famous Leonard Cohen quote where he says, "They sentenced me to 20 years of boredom for trying to change the system from within." You know that song?
Can you repeat it, please?
They sentenced me to 20 years of boredom for trying to change the system from within. And I think I just experienced politics, activism, that whole way of thinking about the world as very boring and alienating and soul murdering. Like, it just, on a very simple, immediate, almost physical level, it was oppressive and uncomfortable. It didn't feel human. It didn't feel alive. It didn't feel good. And art did. And I think that's a good measure of its value or non-value. And I found that activists tended to be really awful people, angry, judgmental, self-righteous, unpleasant people. And I think I was the same way. Like I talked about loving humanity, but my interactions with people were not loving.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think I found that world just off-putting.
Yeah.
And also, it's so obvious to me that like every moment is political. I mean, there's always a choice one is making to be conscious or unconscious or kind or unkind or caring or not caring, and how to prioritize one's needs versus other people's needs in any moment is always like an ethical dilemma. Like every moment is an ethical dilemma. So it just seems really clear to me that you don't have to look outside yourself to be political or to try to make the world a better place. I mean, you're always making it a better or worse place at every moment, no matter what you're doing. And that should be where the focus is, one's own actual sphere of influence versus some imaginary, hypothetical sphere. So I just started doing art and making art about my life, just something I had a little bit of control over and some perspective on. And, I have nothing to say about, I don't know, apartheid or, the war in Ukraine. I mean, it seems awful, but really I know nothing about it and I don't know how to help. But I do know that I have to pick my kids up at a certain time from my ex-wife, and they have certain needs, and I can actually make a difference in their lives. So really, it's kind of that simple.
And the first medium was film?
Yeah.
Why?
I mean, no, it was painting.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can you walk me through that decision of mediums, which mediums to focus on?
Well, it was painting. And I really love painting. I find it very calming and kind of meditative and spiritualizing. It's like music is. Film, I don't think is. I mean, I think film is very hard to do in a meditative way. I think it can be done, but I haven't mastered that at all. But it was really more of an idea that film was a way to integrate politics and art more than painting would or music would. So, I started making, political films. And then, it morphed over time into personal films because of the things we just talked about.
I'm very curious about something that I've heard you mention, the function of form in film. And you've talked about one of your mentors, Jean-Luc Godard. This is obvious, or not obvious, but this becomes clear when you do some research and then watch some of your movies and shows. But I'm curious to hear from your perspective, how do you think, or how do you attempt to challenge the form, and what's the intention? What are you trying to achieve, and in what way do you think you're challenging the form?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer, but a good one. I mean, I think I had this experience where I made a film that I thought was really good, and I showed it to my film teacher, and he said it's like a commercial, and I was offended, and I didn't understand why he was saying that, and that's sort of what my anger or frustration at that sort of is what compelled me to read the book I was supposed to read in class about Godard. And then I sort of understood what he was saying. But I think that the world that we live in, our culture, like it has certain forms. I mean, earlier we were talking about there's a form of like breathing to center. That's a form, and it pre-exists us. Like it's a form that you were taught, that I was taught, that we were given. And you could say it's a good form or a bad form, but it's a ritual or a form. It's a way of doing it, and you can accept it, or you can reject it, or you can tweak it, but it has a certain effect. And it's a technology in a way. It's a technology for raising your consciousness, let's say. But it also has limits in the directions in which it raises your consciousness, or the ways in which it raises your consciousness versus other ways. And cinema is a very rich language with a rich history, and it has implications. There's a worldview. There's a worldview we all inherit in the world, and there are competing worldviews. There's like a religious worldview. There's a scientific worldview. And I think most of us inhabit a scientific worldview. It's materialistic. Matter is real. Spirit, maybe not, and then there are, other beliefs thrown in there. But basically, most people don't believe in fate. They believe in that things are random. The idea of evolution is that there's not really moving towards any transcendental goal. It's just kind of happened because that worked out. And we live our lives based on these kind of received ideas that people share, kind of a consensus reality of what's going on and what things mean. And even ethical things like what's the right thing to do in a situation. I mean, I'm constantly brought up against this difference I have with most people, which is they have a certain notion of ethics that is different than mine, or I disagree with. And a lot of people disapprove of my filmmaking, for example, because they think it's unethical, because, and they say things like, oh, you should never hurt people. And to me, that's an absurd statement for all kinds of reasons. But there's a kind of assumption that is shared. And really what it usually means is try not to hurt anybody overtly and right away. Maybe let the hurt happen later, and let it happen sort of subterraneanly. Like just don't upset anyone is really what it comes to. And another way of saying it is just let's make sure everyone is comfortable and let's not rock the boat. Is kind of the consensus reality of Western society, let's say. And with that comes a whole way of acting, like a certain behaviors, etiquettes, even just like the kinds of things you say to somebody. Hi, how are you doing? And I'm fine. How are you? I mean, that the lie of that everyone engages in immediately is part of the pre-existing form where we're basically saying, I'm going to follow these rules of etiquette, of interpersonal relating, and you are too. And we're just going to like agree that we're in the same language here and we're following the same rules. And I find that oppressive. And so I'm always sort of pushing against those rules. And in cinema, there's an ideology in the way cinematic language works, the way shots work, the way framing works, the way you frame an image, the way you light an image. There are ideas embedded in that. And if you want to change the world, which I do, it seems like you have to also change the forms by which we think and communicate. And I mean, this was what Godard said. He said, basically the forms of cinema are capitalistic. And if you want to create like for him, Marxist or egalitarian forms, you have to, rethink the language of cinema. And he just questions the language. And he does it, beautifully. And he doesn't really give answers. He just like poses questions. Why should the camera be in front of you instead of behind you when you're on a scene?
Mm-hmm.
There are reasons why. It's more interesting. And you can see more of the person's soul, but it's also interesting to not see their face and to see their hands or something. Mm-hmm. And how does that inflect the meaning of the scene? So I just feel like if you're trying to find a different way of being in the world, you have to find a different way of expressing the world and who you are, what life is here for. And I'm just always looking for that. Your question, the hard part of your question was how am I doing that exactly? And it's hard to answer because a lot of it's intuitive, and a lot of it is maybe not even good or correct. But I think by just being honest, honesty for me is my version of morality. Mm-hmm. And I think that we don't know what anything is for or what it will lead to. But I think we do know what's true for us. And if we hew to what's true for us, the right thing will happen because it'll be from truth. Whereas now we usually most of us don't say what's true for us. And instead we think about what we think should happen or should be, or what result we want. Mm-hmm. And the results usually is we don't get the result we want, and we don't do what's true. And people are together who shouldn't be together. All kinds of neuroses happen that don't need to. And I think if everyone was just more honest, everyone would be a lot happier.
Yeah.
And I think people would learn more and they would grow more. And most of etiquette and kindness is just preventing people from growing. It's just all to slow down spiritual growth, really. And I think honesty speeds it up. So I think my main cinematic trope is just that. It's just like honesty. And for me, a lot of that has to do with breaking the frame and saying the thing that you aren't supposed to say in any given moment, both within the shot and outside the shot, and just constantly breaking the established thing that you would expect with what is truer and realer and that people can relate to because you're not alone in feeling these ways. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to put my finger on it or describe it well. But if you watch my films, it's sort of, I think, a process of surprising you with a level of honesty that you didn't expect and undermining their own authority and constantly adding complexity to any ethical question. And really just, they're about ethics. They're really just questioning prevailing ethics is really what they're doing at every turn. I think that's really the main subject of the films. And also they're all about acceptance. I think they're all about just accepting what's real versus what is considered good or virtuous or ideal.
You're talking about the resistance that you have about this etiquette and kindness that feels artificial. What I feel, and also what I'm trying to do even with this podcast, is to search for that honesty, but also, search for that honesty, because I think that it's not always obvious what is true to you. It takes inner work, and it takes courage, and it's a process to know. Once you find the voice that is most truthful, you know that that's your core truth and longing, but it takes time, and I don't think it's immediate for everyone. And so, my question to you is, was this connection to your truth always accessible, or was there a moment that it awakened for you?
Mm-hmm. Well, neither of those.
Okay.
It was not always accessible,
Mm-hmm.
nor was there a moment. It was gradual.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right. I think all of us, it takes time to find what that is. And I think we find it through suffering. Like certain things create suffering. And we're like, okay, well, that's not it, I guess. And I remember when I was in 10th grade, I really wanted to be popular because I hadn't been popular before. And so I tried to put on an act, a mask, a persona that I thought would make me more popular, and it didn't work. And I felt even more alone and stupid.
Mm-hmm.
And, that experience of trying to be someone else to gain approval, I think it's a very common kind of teenage thing to do. But, I learned from it. Like I was like, okay, well, that's not the answer. And then you find, something that feels more true to you, and you just keep doing that, and you keep changing too. Yeah. So it's never like you got it. Like, okay, now this is who I am. It's just like, at best, this is who I am right this second. Mm-hmm. And if I can just be true to that, it'll take me to the next second. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it is. It's hard, and it does take time and consciousness. I'm doing this podcast, as you know, this daily podcast, and it's been, one thing I like about it is just, it's forcing me to grow in all kinds of ways that I hadn't been forced to grow before. And one is, it's not that good. And that's growthful for me.
In what sense that it's not that good? In terms of the audio quality or the concept?
No. Just my performance or my honesty levels aren't always that high.
Okay.
And, I'm not as spiritual as I would like to be. I'm not as conscious as I would like to be. And, I usually, when I make work, I have a lot of time to sort of get it right. I can redo it. And so the image of myself that I can sort of put out there is a little bit better than I am, seem a little smarter than I am, a little whatever. But that's all sort of like, I'm burnishing my image, and it's a little bit, dishonest. But the podcast, I really can't do that. It comes out every day. I just record it on the fly, and I can't really make it better than I am. It's really just like, yeah, it's just more honest. It's just like, it's more human, it's more flawed.
Yeah.
And I've sort of been able to stand myself because I've been able to sort of put out this slightly superior version of myself into the world, and I could live with that. But it's a challenge for me to live with this lower version of myself. Someone said to me recently, like, the word on the street was that my recent work isn't as good as my older work, which has always been my fear, mm-hmm. is that, diminishment in quality. Mm-hmm. But that was also like a good growthful thing to hear and to accept that, okay, fine. People are less impressed. That's good, I think. Also, having to put it out every day. I mean, it's part of the same issue, but, I really like solving problems, or I like making puzzles, I guess. Mm-hmm. And it's a new problem for me, like this podcast. I've never done this. I never had this particular set of problems. And it took me a while, like all problems take a while to figure out. Mm-hmm. It took me a while to figure out how to do it and to find like the inner peace or the inner clarity or the inner, just a moment to like tune in to what am I feeling right now at a deeper level. Because for a while, I don't know how much of the podcast you've listened to, but I was just being very superficial with it. I was just like, I'm going to the store, I'm hungry, here's what's going on, whatever. Mm-hmm. And I thought there was a certain charm in just letting the moment have its vibrational frequency. And there is. But at a certain point, it's like one needs more from a work of art or from, like if you're going to ask people to listen to something, you have to give them a little more than just that. And so to try to like just dig deeper, it's forced me to do that. And I don't always succeed of digging deeply.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, the last few days I've been having this, crisis, mental health crisis for my girlfriend has been going through. And I've had very little time or wherewithal to process it deeply.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just very superficial in a way. But that's okay, I think. I mean, that's part of it. That's the best I can do, and that's fine. But it's growthful is all I'm trying to say. Like, it's good to fail. It's good to find yourself inadequate.
Mm-hmm.
It's good to be able to live with yourself being inadequate and failing. And that's always been a struggle for me personally.
Yeah. As we wrap up, what words would you say to, we can put it as young person or just someone who is sitting with this question. It's not necessarily about the age, but someone who is curious about the possibility of embracing art as a way of life versus at some level keeping art as a hobby, but going conforming for something more conventional. What would you say to them? I don't know if the question is clear to you.
You mean to try to make one's money doing art versus making one's money doing something else?
Yeah, it's related to the money. It's related to the way that you speak. It's very clear that your life is material for what you do professionally. And so I'm personally sitting with this question now, and I know that many people who listen to this are too. If you have artistic curiosities or even spiritual curiosities, and you could also see yourself doing something that is a little bit more corporate or more of a not necessarily artistic occupation. So that's part of it. And then, the precarity of the financial situation you will be in, because that's part of the decision, right? So what would you say to this person to understand internally what to do, or how to think about, or how to experience this question?
That's a hard question also, and an important one. On the one hand, people need to do what they need to do to survive. And everyone has different abilities, limits, allergies, and you do what you can do. I don't think there's no wrong thing to do. It really has to do with what feels okay to you. At the same time, Joseph Campbell, who I really love and admire, used to always say, follow your bliss. And this idea that if you follow your bliss, it's going to take you somewhere good. It's going to support you. I believe in that. That's like an article of faith, but I believe in that. I think if you're doing something you love, the love energy will accumulate and grow. And if you're doing something you hate, that will accumulate and grow. Whatever energy you're putting out is going to increase. And I think doing a job that you hate is a horrible way to live. And I think everybody needs to find something that they can stand and hopefully even enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
And, it can be anything. But you just have to find a way to enjoy it. And, I've tried to do jobs that I couldn't stand. And, I would just quit them after a day or whatever.
For example?
And I had a job once as a PA on a set, and it was so horrible to me to be following orders for a film that was idiotic. It was just like untenable. And then I had a job Xeroxing papers for marketing analyses of audiences in different cities for dumb TV shows. And I couldn't do that for more than a day. I had a job bringing cables to different classrooms at a university. And I don't know, it doesn't sound so bad, but it was. And, I found teaching is something that I can feel okay about. But someone else might find teaching really, soul murdering, and might enjoy, delivering cables. I do think art is a spiritual path. I do think it's a different path than spirituality as a path. And I do think it's my path. I don't think it's the only path or the right path. It's one way to move towards God. I'm not sure it's the fastest way, but it's a way. It's the way I'm doing it. And, it has its own limits, like it's very hard to make art without ego, and to find the egoless place from which to do it, and to both have like clarity and vision, but no ego is tricky. And most art making is about ego, and it's about glory. Most of mine is. And yet there's something in it that is also transcends that. And I think, you can also just try to be egoless, but, the spiritual path is a very ego-filled path too often. And one of the problems with spirituality is most people who practice it are unbearable. The amount of ego and arrogance and phoniness is just, nauseating. So, that's also problematic and tricky. But I do believe that a commitment to an ideal, an artistic ideal, is inherently spiritualizing, even if only through failure and rejection, which is always, I think, growthful and spiritualizing.
If you could speak across time, what words would you say to your 20-year-old self figuring it out?
I don't know. I guess there will be more suffering than you realize or want. And that's okay. It's all for the sake of greater joy in the end.
Thank you, Caveh.
Sure. It's been nice talking to you.
Caveh Zahedi is an American filmmaker, actor, and professor at the New School in New York. You can find more about his work, including I Am a Sex Addict and his most recent podcast, Recording Myself and Everyone Around Me Destroyed All My Relationships, so I'm doing a daily audio journal instead, on the description of this episode. Waking Youth is an independent podcast production that you can find more about at wakingyouth.substack.com. Our theme music is composed and produced by Carlota Guedes, who also edits our episodes, and I'm Carlota Guedes. If you like this episode, I kindly ask you to share it with someone you think would appreciate it. Before you go, thank you for listening, and talk to you next month. Ciao!